Well, good afternoon, and on behalf of all the members of the Westminster College community and all the friends of Sir Winston Churchill, welcome to the National Churchill Museum and to Westminster College, and to this year's Enid and R. Crosby Kemper Lecture, which is a rich tradition here at Westminster College. It's always a great day to be a Blue Jay, and it's always a great day to be a Churchillian, and today is especially a grateful day for the blessings that we have and the opportunity that we have to learn with our speaker today. I want to express my gratitude to the Crosby Kemper Foundation of Kansas City for providing the grant to make this lecture possible since 1979. Inspired by the famous Iron Curtain speech delivered on our campus by Sir Winston Churchill in 1946, this series builds on that great event in Westminster's history to provide lectures by prominent speakers on British history and Sir Winston Churchill. This grant has brought distinguished speakers to the National Churchill Museum, ranging from Churchill's daughter, Lady Mary Soames, and granddaughter, Edwina Sands, to British Lord Roy Jenkins and Sir John Colville, Sir Max Hastings, and official Churchill biographer, Sir Martin Gilbert. Through these lectures, we see the relevance of Churchill today. And their messages reinforce the leadership model and character we use here at Westminster College to educate our students to lead and inspire them to achieve. Today we are pleased to have R. Crosby Kemper III with us, representing the Kemper family, to introduce the 2012 lecturer. Well known in Kansas City for his civic leadership and as former CEO of UMB Bank and UMB Financial Corporation, Mr. Kemper is also an historical scholar, particularly in the field of Churchill studies. He is the editor and author of Winston Churchill, Resolution, Defiance, Magnanimity, Goodwill, and a member of the Board of Governors for the Association of Churchill Fellows. Mr. Kemper has also served as Executive Director of the British Institute of the United States in New York and has taught English in China. Among his many significant contributions to the arts, he has chaired and helped found both the Heart of America Shakespeare Festival and the St. Louis Shakespeare Festival. Currently, Mr. Kemper is Executive Director of the Kansas City Public Library and is co-founder and chair of the Show Me Institute, a free market public policy think tank for the state of Missouri. Please join me in a warm Westminster College and National Churchill Museum welcome to a dear friend of the college and the museum, R. Crosby Kemper III. Crosby.
Thank you. President Forsyth, Senior Fellow and sometime Lord of the Manor Tyler, fellow governors, fellow fellows, ladies and gentlemen, we are privileged to welcome to our sanctuary Sir David Nicholas Cannadine. His distinguished career as historian, biographer, and broadcaster began as an undergraduate at Clare College, Cambridge, continued with graduate study at St. John's College, Oxford. Then, in order to confuse his own biographers, he took a research fellowship at St. John's College, Cambridge. And then a university lecturer and fellow at Christ College, Cambridge. He fell under the spell there of Sir John Plumb, as indeed many of us here at the Churchill Memorial have fallen under the same spell. Not long after that, Sir John Plumb said of David Cannadine that he was the brightest, liveliest, and most readable of younger historians in Britain. For one who has celebrated the ceremonial aspects of British imperial history, it was only right that he became the Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother Professor at the Institute of Historical Research at the University of London. In the colonies, he has taught at Columbia and now at Princeton. A tribute to Sir David's talent and taste as a biographer, he is now the chair of the National Portrait Gallery in London. He was knighted by the Queen in the New Year's Honors of 2009 for his services to education, which manifestly include his long, stellar television career. Professor Cannadine's magnum opus, The Decline of the British Aristocracy, secured his reputation as among the most important British historians of his generation. Within Churchill's shadow, he has taken what he believes to be the biographer's purpose to get behind the myths and portrayed Winston Churchill as perhaps the savior of his country, as he quotes A.G.P. Taylor's saying, but also present at and indeed the efficient cause of the end of the British Empire. And yet, in his other masterwork, Ornamentalism, How the British Saw Their Empire, his brilliant revision of recent demythologizing views of empire, David Cannadine draws a picture of the affinities, perhaps constructed, perhaps imagined, but nonetheless real, of metropolis and colony, king, queen, subject, imperialists, and their empire. And quoting James Anthony Froude, recreating English life all over again, something we in Fulton know about. The power, the consequences of these affinities and the myth of empire, whose greatest voice, the lion's voice, Churchill was, is his great subject. The need for hierarchy and order, whether in Burke's peerage, Burke's colonial gentry, or the natural order of Edmund Burke, is his subject. Just as he has seen the affinities of the mother country and her children as central to imperial history in his biographical work on Churchill, Trevelyan, Mellon, and others, he has shown the not uncritical sympathy of a great biographer himself, making him worthy to be in a succession from Thomas Babington Macaulay to his great nephew, G.M. Trevelyan, to his last student, J.H. Plum, to his student, successor, ladies and gentlemen, David Cannadine.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm so intimidated and overwhelmed by such a kind and generous, indeed extravagant introduction that it leads me to want to rework a familiar phrase and to say that in your hands, flattery is the sincerest form of intimidation. In any event, it's a huge pleasure and privilege and honor and delight to be here this afternoon to help once again celebrate one of the greatest figures of the 20th century and one of the greatest Britons ever to have lived, who is very properly still thought of as a figure who not only lived a titanic and extraordinary and Olympian career in his own times, but still, such was the extraordinary nature of his achievements, has much to teach us about the world we're in and about the world as it might become. And it's a delight to discover that so much of that teaching is going on here. Fulton, for anyone of my generation or older, is a place of pilgrimage. It's where Churchill made one of his most significant and influential speeches in the years after the Second World War. And it is, as I've come to learn in my alas all too brief visit, a place of education and inspiration, drawing much of its strength from that amazing encounter with Churchill back in March 1946. I'm also, of course, enormously honored and flattered to find myself delivering the Kemper Lecture following a list of extraordinarily and intimidatingly distinguished people, many of whom I have to say were or still are old friends: Jack Plum, Robert Rhodes James, Robert Blake, Philip Ziegler, Michael Howard, Mary Soames herself, Robin Winks, Roger Lewis, Roy Jenkins, and only last year, Max Hastings. I'm immensely honored to find myself in their company. Roy Jenkins, remarkably, when in his 70s and 80s, on a scale of endeavour which can very properly be called Churchillian, wrote the life of Gladstone, the greatest British Prime Minister of the 19th century, and he wrote the life of Churchill, the greatest Prime Minister of the 20th century. And having concluded the second of those biographies, that's to say of Churchill, he observed that even comparing Gladstone and Churchill, there was no doubt that Churchill was the most remarkable and extraordinary human being ever to have occupied 10 Downing Street. And think what you will of David Cameron, I don't think his recent arrival there causes us in any way to modify that conclusion. There are many aspects of Churchill's remarkableness and extraordinariness, not the least of which is that the more work that is done on Churchill, the more we are still finding out about him, when you might think we already knew more than enough about him as things stand. And my theme today, I hope, will illustrate that, perhaps in a minor way, but nevertheless in ways that I hope might be of some interest. Churchill was not, I think, a great painter, but he was beyond any doubt an exceptionally accomplished painter, and painting in turn was an integral part of his own greatness. And it's about that combination of Churchill's painting and Churchill's greatness that I would like to talk this afternoon. A combination which plays out in two ways, I think. First of all, that painting was important to Churchill privately, individually, and personally. But secondly, in the years of his greatness and of his fame, painting became an essential, indeed integral part of his remarkable and extraordinary public persona. And it's about those things, if I may, that I'd like to talk this afternoon. I'm sure that none of you present here need reminding that Winston Churchill was born in 1874 in Blenheim Palace, which was then one of the greatest treasure houses of Britain, chock-a-block with the most extraordinary collection of paintings, of portraits, and of old masters. Churchill remained devoted to his ancestral home all his life, and in his later years he would vividly and affectionately depict its spectacular exteriors and its magnificent interiors, of which this, of course, is one. But that fabulous, spectacular artistic heritage made no lasting impact on the young Winston, because it was significantly diminished during the mid-1880s, when most of the greatest family pictures were dispersed to the National Gallery and to the sale rooms. And that irreparable aesthetic damage to Blenheim was scarcely compensated for when 20 years later, Churchill's cousin, Sonny, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, commissioned John Singer Sargent to paint his bravura family portrait, which adorns Blenheim to this day. The sale of those greatest pictures in the Marlborough collection may help explain why Churchill never seems to have shown any interest in European old masters or in the great tradition of English portraiture running from Holbein via Van Dyck and Lawrence to Sargent himself. And it's surely significant that his most successful paintings of Blenheim interiors are of rooms hung with tapestries celebrating his greatest forebear, rather than with the less distinguished canvases that had survived the aesthetic depredations of the mid-1880s. The disappearance of the greatest Blenheim pictures when he was still a boy may well be one of the reasons why Churchill would later claim that apart from a few drawings rather reluctantly undertaken when he was at school and in the army, he had demonstrated no serious awareness of art or appreciation of art or ability at art at any point during the first 40 years of his life. Such was his recollection, as reported years later by Clementine Churchill and as recorded by Churchill's doctor, Lord Moran. This is what Moran wrote, quoting Clemmy. When Winston took up painting in 1915, he had never up to that moment been in any picture gallery. He went with me to the National Gallery, and pausing before the first picture, a very ordinary affair, he appeared absorbed in it. For half an hour, he studied its technique minutely. Next day, he visited the gallery once more, but I took him this time by the left entrance instead of the right, so that I might at least be sure he would not return to the same picture again. Such, indeed, is the conventional wisdom about Churchill's belated engagement with what he himself described as paints, palettes, and canvases, a wisdom that he would himself do much to create when it came to writing his essays that would later be republished as Painting as a Pastime. But while this is indeed part of the truth of things, and a significant part of the truth of things, I would like to suggest this afternoon that it's not the whole truth of things. As in painting, so in virtually every other of his astonishing range of activities, Churchill turns out to be even more amazing, even more remarkable, and even more extraordinary than we might originally have thought. There isn't any doubt that that quotation, Lord Moran of Clementine, reinforces the view put forward by one of my predecessors here, J.H. Plum, that despite Churchill's many and extraordinary range of gifts, there was always about him, his painting, and indeed much else that he did, a touch of the Philistine. His literary culture was confined to that of his class and his time. The Bible, Shakespeare, Milton, Scott, Dickens, and a little trollop, topped off with the poems of Rudyard Kipling. His taste in music was restricted to Gilbert and Sullivan operetta, to the songs of the late Victorian music hall, to Viennese operetta, to military marches, and above all, to Land of Hope and Glory and Rule Britannia. He did not turn hungrily to the works of philosophers, economists, or social scientists, and showed no interest in engaging with Marx or Freud or Max Weber, the giant intellectual figures of his youth and middle age. His models in history writing were not the innovative scholars of his own time, but two men long since dead, namely Gibbon and Macaulay. And in addition to showing no interest in European old masters or the great tradition of English portraiture, Churchill never evinced any enthusiasm for abstract art as it developed and evolved during his own long lifetime, in the hands of such innovative masters as Picasso, Matisse, or Chagall. Thus understood, Churchill was neither an intellectual nor an aesthete, but a soldier, a politician, and a man of action. And not surprisingly then, his first appearances at Britain's Royal Academy's summer dinner in the years before the First World War were because of his importance as a government minister, not because he had any standing in the art world at all. Yet while all that is true, and while it is easy to dismiss Churchill as being in some ways culturally uninformed, incurious, and unsophisticated, he was in other ways both exceptionally imaginative and remarkably creative. No less, in the words of A.L. Rouse, an artist than a politician. And this was something he owed to his Spencer rather than to his Marlborough forebears, and also perhaps to his mother's family, the Jeromes of New York City. By whatever process, the artistic strain in Churchill's family and among his forebears was strong. His otherwise rather wayward nephew, John Churchill, who was the eldest son of Winston's younger brother Jack, made a successful career as an artist and sculptor and as a painter of murals, portraits, and frescoes. Churchill helped John on his way, employing him in the mid-1930s to decorate the summer house at Chartwell with scenes of the Duke of Marlborough's 4 greatest battles. And John would later go on to decorate a temple at Blenheim Palace for the 10th Duke of Marlborough. In the same way, Churchill's even more wayward niece, Claire Sheridan as she became, who was the daughter of Lady Randolph Churchill's elder sister, was an accomplished sculptor. Now it has to be said that Claire and her uncle Winston violently disagreed about politics. She was an ardent supporter of communist Russia and as a result sculpted a bust of Lenin 2.5 times life size. But she also completed a memorable bust of Churchill in the 1920s and another in the 1940s, although neither of them, it must be said, on the scale of her earlier piece on Lenin. And in later generations, Winston's daughter Sarah, who was cousin to both John Churchill and Claire Sheridan, would also be an actress and a painter, and his granddaughter Edwina Sands is, of course, a renowned sculptor and artist, as I hardly need to remind anyone who has visited Fulton. It is then fair to say that Churchill's genetic inheritance does seem to have included a genuinely artistic strain, but it was exceptionally pronounced and well developed in his own case. From an early age, Churchill seems to have been gifted with the heightened perception of the artist, to whom no scene, no event, no individual was ever dull or humdrum or commonplace. This is self-evidently true in his use of the English language, which he handled in his conversation, his speeches, and his books with the sure touch, the sensuous feel, and the imaginative brilliance of an artist, as he delighted in strong words, rich imagery, polished antitheses, glowing phrases, and memorable effects. There was nothing dull or humdrum or commonplace about his use of words. And although his canvases lacked the stately splendor, the heroic grandeur, and the formal magnificence of his greatest set-piece orations, they strikingly resemble his oratory in other ways, often being bright, vivid, highly coloured and brilliantly illuminated creations, full of arresting contrasts between the light and the dark, the sun and the shadows. And when Churchill later wrote about painting, one of his descriptions of the finished product as a long, sustained, interlocking argument characterized by a single unity of conception and purpose would apply with equal appropriateness to the composition and the structure of his finest speeches. Moreover, Churchill not only possessed a powerful verbal imagination, but he was also endowed with an equally strong visual imagination, visual appreciation, and visual sense. Despite his own later insistence to the contrary, the drawing classes he took at Harrow and at Sandhurst do seem to have made a lasting impact on him. And he was fascinated, for example, by political cartoons from an early age, about which he wrote a famous and very revealing essay. Even in his first and earliest books, published in the late 1890s, Churchill possessed and demonstrated an extraordinary capacity to visualize a scene, to recreate it in words, to evoke landscapes, to describe cities and towns and villages, and to capture the din and noise and destruction of battle. And all that may later explain Churchill's subsequent interest in moving pictures and in the cinema. During the 1930s, he wrote several screenplays for Alexander Korda and his London film production studio, none of which, in fact, ever went into production. He made friends with Charlie Chaplin, whom he met in Hollywood and who later visited at Chartwell, where it soon became clear that his political views made even those of Claire Sheridan seem rather sensible and middle of the road. In 1935, Churchill wrote an essay comparing the relative merits of silent and talking movies. And of course, during the long, hard years of war, late-night film sessions at Chequers were an essential part of Churchill's wartime regime. Here, let me give you, is one example of Churchill's remarkable capacity to convey a scene and evoke a landscape as a word picture. It's from his novel Savrola, and it describes the broad panorama that could be glimpsed from the balcony of the presidential palace in the fictional republic of Laurania. The scene which now stretched before her was one of surpassing beauty. The palace stood high upon high ground, commanding a wide view of the city and the harbour. The sun was low on the horizon, but the walls of the houses still stood out in glaring white. The red and blue tiled roofs were relieved by frequent gardens and squares, whose green and graceful palms soothed and gratified the eye. Many white-sailed smacks dotted the waters of the Mediterranean Sea, which had already begun to change their blue for the more gorgeous colours of the sunset. This is not only a vivid and highly pigmented word picture, it also anticipates many of the harbour scenes along the French Riviera and the Mediterranean coast, which Churchill would become so fond of as an artist from the 1920s and 1930s on. Having, as it were, begun life painting in words, later in life, Churchill moves on to painting in paints. In other words, while he did not actually take up what he called painting as a pastime until his 40th year, Churchill actually had quite a lot going for him, more than he later let on, when he actually finally got round to it. Nevertheless, and as is well known, he took up the activity suddenly, unexpectedly, and therapeutically, and with characteristic relish, but it's fair to say, with uncharacteristic diffidence. During the summer of 1915, his spirits were at their lowest ebb in the aftermath of the Dardanelles disaster, for which, fairly or unfairly, rightly or wrongly, he bore the brunt of the political blame as First Lord of the Admiralty. Out of power, and very soon out of office, he was haunted by what he termed the black dog of a depression so deep that Clementine feared he would die of grief. Just as a drowning man or woman grabs at a lifebelt, so Churchill now turned to painting as a new way to engage his energies, to blot out political failure, to banish the black dog, to revive his spirits, and to enable him to enjoy life again. Here is the earliest picture of Churchill actually painting. At the time of this picture, Winston and Clemmy had rented Hoe Farm, a small country house in Surrey, where Churchill's brother Jack and his wife often came to stay. And it was Churchill's sister-in-law who first persuaded Winston to paint, and here, in fact, he is, as it were, painting her, though she herself was a watercolourist, whereas Churchill soon came to prefer oils as being the stronger and much more robust medium. Churchill was immediately hooked, captivated, enthralled by the challenges and opportunities of painting. And during these early years, he experimented with a variety of styles and a variety of subjects, which in retrospect, I think, are hugely subjective and interesting and have not, I think, been remotely adequately explored. One of the first artists to give Churchill advice was his London neighbour, Sir John Lavery, whose wife Hazel was also an artist. And this may explain why Churchill painted more portraits at this time than he would later do, including one very extraordinary self-portrait. This is almost Francis Bacon-like, I think, in its depiction of the desolation, despair, depression, disappointment, loneliness that Churchill was feeling at exactly this time. It's an extraordinarily haunting painting, utterly unlike the pictures for which later Churchill became famous. When he went off to the war, to the Western Front in 1916, he took his brushes and his easels with him. And the result was several powerful wartime paintings of devastated buildings and war-torn countryside. Very different again in this early phase were the pictures he painted of Cairo in 1921, when he attended a conference there as colonial secretary. And it's those paintings, painted at Cairo, which anticipate the later sun-drenched canvases of Marrakesh and the Mediterranean, with which he became so much associated. The result of all this was that from the early 1920s, Churchill began to visit galleries as he fell in love with the impressionist use of light and colour. And he established a studio at Chartwell, where he would spend many happy hours when not dictating his books, or, as he turned out to do, laying bricks. Well, the result of this sudden love affair with painting, which became lifelong, was that across more than 4 decades, Churchill would eventually complete somewhere in the order of 500 canvases. An astonishing output, given the many other calls on his time, his energy, and his imagination. In terms of his non-political activities, his painting would soon come to rank second to his writing, although at other times polo playing and bricklaying also consumed much of his time and attention. But there were 2 significant differences. Churchill wrote for serious public purposes, to make the substantial sums of money needed to finance his lavish style of life, to celebrate his family, and to vindicate his own record. History, he observed on one occasion, will not be kind to Neville Chamberlain. I know, because I'm going to write it. By contrast, Churchill seems to have painted entirely for therapy and for enjoyment. It helped to keep the black dog of depression at bay. It was a hobby and a relaxation rather than an occupation. And he never intended to sell his canvases for money, though he did hope Clementine might do so later if she was pressed for cash, which indeed she did. But in addition, and unlike his writing, indeed unlike virtually everything else Churchill did except perhaps sleep, painting was the only activity which he carried on, even when surrounded by a large entourage in the later days of his greatness and his fame, in concentrated and complete silence. It was the only time in the day when he was awake that he never talked. When he painted, it absorbed him utterly, taking his mind off everything else and off everybody else too. And that indeed for Churchill was what it was designed to do. Well, the result was that by the early 1920s, Churchill had become sufficiently experienced to set down his thoughts on painting in several articles which initially appeared in the Strand magazine. And along with his early novel, Savrola, they are among the most self-revealing words that he ever wrote. They were, he explained to Clementine, very light and amusing, without in any way offending the professional painters. For someone with such a towering and self-centered ego, Churchill wrote with uncharacteristic humility and self-deprecating candor about his own limited artistic talents and his modest painterly efforts as a self-confessed weekend and holiday amateur. We must not be ambitious, he insisted. We cannot aspire to masterpieces. We may content ourselves with a joyride in a paint box. What a wonderful Churchill phrase that is, a joyride in a paint box. But for this, he concluded, confidence reasserting itself, audacity is the only ticket. He wrote in favourable terms of John Ruskin and shared Ruskin's delight in bright, vivid colours. I rejoice with the brilliant ones and feel genuinely sorry for the poor, drab, dismal browns. He wrote appreciatively of Turner and the French Impressionists, especially their fascination with the effect of light on landscape. And as befitted the former soldier that he was, he envisaged his painterly counters with intimidatingly empty canvases as a battle of will which he was determined to win by an overwhelming display of forceful colours and colourful force. By the mid-1920s, as those comments about colour and light suggest, Churchill had largely given up painting people and had settled on landscapes and vistas, still lives and interior and exterior scenes as his preferred subjects. Subjects in a way which are an antidote to depression rather than, as in that self-portrait, an expression of it. As these canvases accumulated, Churchill became increasingly widely known as a painter, which meant that he now attended the annual dinners of the Royal Academy, not only as a major politician, he was Chancellor of the Exchequer in Baldwin's Conservative government for much of the 1920s, but also as a recognised and reputable amateur artist. In 1927, in replying to the toast to His Majesty's government, Churchill spoke on art and politics, insisting that artists were among the most fortunate mortals on the globe because their work was also their joy. The paintings on display that year, Churchill went on, were the result of hours of pleasure, hours of intense creative enjoyment, resulting in what he revealingly described as bottled sunshine, captured inspiration, perennial delight. In comparing art and politics, Churchill went on, flair and judgment were equally necessary in both activities. And there were three dominant elements of each profession that were common to both, namely colour, proportion, and design. Churchill had no doubt which of those three was the most important and which he himself preferred. Colour ranks far above proportion and design, both in painting and in politics. I admire it very much indeed in painting, he went on, and to general amusement he added, I am not entirely averse to it in politics either. During the 1930s, Churchill was out of office for almost the whole of the decade. He spent much of his time writing his multi-volume biography of his great ancestor, the first Duke of Marlborough, and painting was his preferred form of recreation and relaxation. Many of his best pictures from this period are either of other country houses in Britain that he visited, or in some cases of Chartwell itself, where he had a studio, but which also provided lots of subjects for his easel, or also the mansions owned by Consuelo Vanderbilt, Lord Rothermere, and Maxine Elliot in France, where Churchill was a regular visitor. Here is a wonderful account of Churchill as a painter at this time by Consuelo Balzan, at whose house Churchill often stayed. This is what she wrote. Winston used to spend his mornings dictating to his secretary and his afternoons painting either in our garden, and here is the chateau which Consuelo owned, which Churchill painted, or on some other site that pleased him. His departure on these expeditions was invariably accompanied by a general upheaval of the household. The painting paraphernalia with its easel, parasol and stool had to be assembled, the brushes freshly cleaned to be found, the canvas chosen, the right hat sorted out, the cigar box replenished. At last, driven by our chauffeur and accompanied by a detective the British government insisted upon providing, he would depart with a genial wave and rubicund smile that we have learned to associate with his robust optimism. On his return, he would amuse us by repeating the comments of those self-sufficient critics who congregate round easels. An old Frenchman one day told him, with a few more lessons, you will become quite good. It was during this period, the 1930s, that Churchill finally and above all fell in love with the bright colours and the warm sunshine of the French Riviera. And it was during the winter of 1935 to 1936 that he also discovered for the first, but by no means the last time, the painterly delights and potential of Marrakesh in Morocco. Although out of power, Churchill attended the Royal Academy dinners regularly during the wilderness years of the 1930s, and he was asked to speak on several occasions. In 1935, for instance, he spoke on tradition and novelty in art. The functions of such an institution as the Royal Academy, Churchill insisted, is to hold a middle course between tradition and innovation. Without tradition, art is a flock of sheep without a shepherd. Without innovation, it is a corpse. But innovation for Churchill had its limits. It is not the function of the Royal Academy to run wildly after novelty. Now more than ever, Churchill believed it was the purpose of the Academy to give strong, precious and enduring aid to British painting and sculpture. In this hard material age of brutal force, he concluded, speaking only a few weeks after Hitler had annexed Austria, we ought indeed to cherish the arts. Ill fares the race which failed to salute the arts with the reverence and delight which are their due. Well, during the Second World War, when Churchill was titanically busy, as affairs of state took all his waking and working hours, Churchill gave up his brushes and his canvases almost completely. But let me just mention two very revealing episodes. The first is the powerful, painterly visual image which he used to such telling effect in the peroration of his great 1940 speech ending, "This was their finest hour," in which he contrasted the abyss of a new dark age into which Europe would sink if Hitler triumphed, to the broad, sunlit uplands which might be gained if Hitler could be defeated. Broad, sunlit uplands were the vistas which Churchill greatly loved to paint, and they now became the pictorial and metaphorical destination to which he hoped he might lead his country and its allies to victory. Appropriately enough, and this is my second point, the only canvas Churchill completed while wartime Prime Minister could be described in exactly those terms. A view of Marrakesh, drenched in sunlight and rising towards the high peaks of the Atlas Mountains in the distance, which he painted in January 1943 after his earlier meeting with President Roosevelt at Casablanca. It was one brief break from the pressures of war, and Churchill later gave the painting to Roosevelt as a memento of their visit, and it's recently in fact been sold by Roosevelt's grandson. Well, just as Churchill had discovered the therapeutic value of painting at a dark time in his life during the First World War, so he turned to it again in the aftermath of his defeat in the general election of 1945. Even before the votes had been counted, he'd gone off to the south of France for a brief holiday, where he had taken out his paints for the first time since Marrakesh. And in September 1945, he headed to Italy to the shores of Lake Como, where Field Marshal Alexander, the supreme Allied commander in the Mediterranean, a Churchill favourite and also a fellow painter, offered him a villa. "I paint all day and every day," Winston wrote to his daughter Mary, "and have banished care and disillusionment to the shades." Alex came and painted too. "I am confident," he wrote to Clementine in another letter, "that with a few more months of regular practice, I shall be able to paint better than I have ever painted before. This new interest is very necessary in my life." Thereafter, painting for Churchill would be a major relaxation, as he took time off from his war memoirs, from leading the Conservative opposition, and from making triumphant visits to the United States and to many of the capital cities of Europe. As before, much of his painting was done in his studio at Chartwell, and France and Morocco were again especial favourites. Painting picnics on these holidays were often organised on a lavish and extraordinary scale, and Churchill produced some of his most successful works during this period, more of these warm, brightly lit, sun-drenched Mediterranean landscapes and seascapes. But by this time, Churchill's painting was no longer just a private hobby and a matter of personal therapy. It also now became a part of his vastly enhanced public reputation as the man of the half-century, the accolade which Time magazine bestowed upon him in 1950. 3 years before that, Churchill had submitted 2 pictures to be hung at the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition, of which this is one, under the name of David Winter. Both were accepted. In 1948, following a unanimous resolution of the Council and the General Assembly, Churchill was elected an honorary academician extraordinary, and his earlier writings on art were republished as Painting as a Pastime, which became a bestseller and was translated into many languages. In 1949, the annual Royal Academy Summer Dinner was revived after a lapse of 10 years, in part thanks to Churchill's prompting. At the end of that dinner, the President, Sir Alfred Munnings, made a speech which it would be polite to call uninhibited and more accurate to call intoxicated, which unfortunately was broadcast on the radio live, in which he took the occasion to denounce the Academy itself, the Arts Council, and the Tate Gallery, inveighed against what he called the foolish daubers of Cézanne, Matisse, and Picasso, and to make matters worse, insisted that Churchill, who was present on that occasion, no doubt shared those opinions as well. Well, he very probably did, but he subsequently rebuked Munnings for publicising the contents of a private conversation. And so great was the outrage caused by his speech in the art world that he soon after had to resign as president of the Academy. By contrast, Churchill's relationship with it went from strength to strength, and he exhibited every year between 1948 and 1951. During his final premiership, from early 1951 to the spring of 1955, the press of events and his own advancing years meant that Churchill once again had little time for painting. But he covered a few canvases on his occasional sojourns at Lord Beaverbrook's Mediterranean villa, and also on a brief trip to Jamaica in the aftermath of a visit to the American president, where he lectured Noel Coward firmly but kindly about painting in oils instead of dabbling away at watercolours. Painting by now had become an essential part of Churchill's public persona, and one of the tributes, published in a book that was produced to mark his 80th birthday, came from the director of the Tate Gallery, Sir John Rothenstein. By the skillful choice of subject within his range, he is able to paint pictures of real merit which bear an intimate and quite direct relation to his outlook on life. A perceptive remark indeed. Every year, Churchill continued to exhibit at the Royal Academy, and he was a regular attender and speaker at its summer banquets, when he continued to urge the need to hold a middle course between tradition and innovation. In the spring of 1955, Churchill retired as Prime Minister, and his political life was effectively over. Freed for the last time from the cares and burdens of high office, his final decade would be one of private leisure, and as he had earlier foreseen in one of the essays republished in Painting as a Pastime, his brushes and his canvases would play a large and fulfilling part in it. This is what he'd written. One by one, the more vigorous sports and exacting games fall away. Exceptional exertions are purchased only by a more pronounced and more prolonged fatigue. Muscles may relax and feet and hands slow down. The nerve and youth and manhood may become less trusty. But painting is a friend who makes no undue demands, excites to no exhausting pursuits, keeps faithful pace with feeble steps, and holds her canvas as a screen between us and the envious eyes of time or the surly advance of decrepitude. Happy are the painters, for they shall not be lonely. Light and colour, peace and hope will keep company to the end, or almost to the end of the day. During the late 1950s, Churchill spent a great deal of time on the French Riviera, relishing its warmth and sunshine and light and colour, and usually staying with Lord Beaverbrook or with Emery and Wendy Reeves. In such luxurious surroundings and with such congenial company, he completed his 4-volume history of the English-speaking peoples and painted many of his last works. And there was also a final visit to Marrakesh in 1959, which resulted in yet more canvases. But Churchill's last decade was not only one of private leisure. It was also one of public apotheosis, in which he was, beyond any question, the most famous man in the world. And here too, his pictures played their part. In 1958, an exhibition of 35 of his paintings was put on in Kansas City, and the introduction to the catalogue was written by his former colleague and fellow painter, President Eisenhower. So popular and so successful was this exhibition that it travelled to virtually every major city in the United States and was exhibited in virtually every major gallery, with one exception. The director of the Art Institute of Chicago declared that the pictures were of insufficient artistic merit to be displayed on the walls of his institute. So great was the public outcry that within 2 weeks he was obliged to resign. And although Churchill had previously resisted any attempt to put on a one-man show in London, the success of this North American display emboldened the Royal Academy to ask him again. And the resulting exhibition, augmented by 26 additional canvases, finally opened in London in March 1959. It was a huge success, and its run was extended from the end of May to the end of July, by which time over 140,000 people had seen it, a greater number than for any other Royal Academy exhibition up to that time, with the exception of Churchill's fellow artist, Leonardo da Vinci. We think, the President of the Royal Academy wrote to Churchill on the exhibition's closure, it has deservedly marked in the most effective and significant way your historic membership of the Royal Academy, thus crowning in our annals your extraordinary title. By then, Churchill was visibly aging, as the surly advance of decrepitude was becoming irresistible, and as the end of his day drew inexorably closer, he painted his last canvases in the autumn of 1960. Some of them were wistful and romantic, and the vigour that had once imbued his work was no longer there. Yet he continued to exhibit earlier canvases at the Royal Academy until his last summer of 1964, by which time he had contributed more than 50 paintings to the annual exhibition, without a break since 1947. His attendance at the annual summer dinner also remained a fixture in his schedule until 1963, and he was invariably accompanied by his bodyguard, Sergeant Murray, himself a talented amateur painter. In 1959, and in the midst of his triumphant one-man show, Churchill was acclaimed by Harold Macmillan as the greatest living amateur painter, an observation that was greeted with rapturous applause. And 2 years later, Harold Nicholson confided this affectionate and moving entry to his diary. I went to the Royal Academy summer banquet and enjoyed it very much. Field Marshal Montgomery was there, and many friends such as Tom Elliot, Tommy Lascelles, Oliver Isher, and so on. I watched Winston leaving. The president of the Academy took one arm and the attendant another, and they almost carried the old boy down the steps. He is frightfully old. His eyes are bleary and immobile. I watched his huge bald head descending the staircase, and I blessed it as it disappeared. A voice behind me said, "We may never see that again." I turn round. It is Clement Attlee. As someone whose father had achieved much less than his allotted span, who did not expect his own life to be of lengthy duration, and who had often witnessed the carnage and killing of war at first hand, Churchill had brooded much upon the meaning of life and the mysteries of death. And he never did so to more eloquent or to more moving effect than in these words from the closing pages of his great biography of his great ancestor, the first Duke of Marlborough. "The span of mortals is short," Churchill wrote there, "their end universal. It is foolish to waste time lamenting the closing phases of life. Noble souls yield themselves willingly to the successively falling shades, which carry them to a better world or to oblivion." But which, for Churchill, was it to be? He never quite could make up his mind which of those destinies and which of those destinies awaited him. As the religious skeptic he had been for most of his life, he often thought that the end would indeed be the end, and that the best that could be hoped for was a kind of dark, perpetual, and unconscious nothingness, to which he gave the revealing name black velvet. And since Churchill didn't like the colour black and had been haunted for much of his life by the black dog, he can hardly have been enthused by that dark and dim and dismal prospect. Yet in his more buoyant, optimistic and sunny mode, Churchill did indeed entertain the possibility that there might be life after death, and he once set down his thoughts as to what he would do and how he would spend his time if he ever reached the safe and happy haven of the next world. And appropriately and revealingly, those thoughts were about paints and brushes and canvases and easels. When I get to heaven, Churchill had written in one of those essays subsequently republished in Painting as a Pastime, I mean to spend a considerable portion of my first 1,000,000 years in painting, and so to get to the bottom of the subject, assisted and enabled, as he felt certain he would be, by a much gayer palette than I get here below, and by a whole range of wonderful new colours which will delight the celestial eye. If there is any justice in this world, and if there is any chance of the next, then somehow and somewhere Winston Churchill may even now be painting vividly and vigorously away. And after his long and extraordinary life of epic endeavours and heroic achievements, only the meanest of spirits and coldest of hearts would begrudge him a well-earned repose in such a brilliantly illuminated eternity, full as in his presence it must surely be of light and colour, peace and hope. Thank you.
So David, thank you so much for that enlightening, illuminating, and entertaining exposition of a fascinating topic and a very unique perspective on Sir Winston Churchill. Thank you, Sir David, once again.